Welcome back to Political Psychology, everybody. Let me share my screen with you and we will jump into today's lecture on cognition, social identity, emotions, and attitudes. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, kind of broken up into these four different categories. So let's talk about cognition and attitude theories first, then we'll talk about social identity, and then we'll close out talking about emotions. So with cognitions, it's just a fancy word for how people think. How are you thinking about the world, your attitudes, your likes, your dislikes, your values, how you're kind of processing, making sense of the information around you. So people have attitudes towards a lot of different things, likes, dislikes for political issues, for certain foods, for politicians, like you name it. So do people's attitudes predict their behavior? If potential voters say, you know what, I like this candidate, will that liking of the candidate predict kind of voter turnout behavior? And the answer is, it depends, right? There's a lot of research showing that when social pressures are minimal, there's a stronger correlation between people's attitudes and behavior. Meaning if people don't feel compelled to answer a certain way, they don't feel pressured to do a certain thing. If you allow them to like truly reflect their true attitude and truly act however they would want to act, those conditions are when you find the greatest correlation between attitudes and behavior. That's not the real world, right? People are motivated to see themselves in a certain light. So if you ask people, are you racist? They lie and say, no, I'm not racist at all. Even though, you know, later on, if they are truly racist, they might engage in some sort of discriminatory behavior. When it comes to politics, like, do you like a certain politician? People are often kind of dealing with this sort of self-presentation strategies of, what does the person asking this question want my answer to be? Do I like this person? Are they a friend? Are they a potential boyfriend, girlfriend? Like, are they a potential employer? If so, you might act and say that you either like or dislike a person just because it kind of vibes with the other pressures in the room. If that's the case, you have conformity, which kind of cuts the predictive value of attitudes on behavior. And there are a ton of different attitude theories that explain this kind of relationship between attitudes and behavior. Let me touch on a few of them today. The first one is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've probably heard of this before, that people's attitudes or kind of expectations of the future will affect their behavior, right? Our expectations shape our behavior. And this process involves 3 steps. So the first step is the perceiver, you, forms some expectation about a target, right? Someone else. You might have the expectation that, hey, this person is really likable, right? It's like really, like you've heard through the grapevine or whatever, that this person is just a really, really nice, awesome human being. So that's your first step. You have this expectation about someone else. In step 2, you, the perceiver, acts towards that person based on your expectations. So if you expect this person to be nice, now you start treating that person a certain way. You go up to them and you smile and you say, hey, I brought donuts from home. Do you want any? Right? Notice that your expectation triggered your behavior that's in line with your expectations. And then in the third and final step, the target, right? The person who you think is nice, that person is going to interpret your actions and respond in a way that's consistent. So if someone offers you like free donuts, you're like, that's awesome. That's really nice of you. Thank you very much. Then you go out of your way to learn this person's name, to smile more often, to bring in more donuts the next day. And what this leads to, since they responded in kind, it confirms or reinforces your initial expectation of, hey, this person's really nice. See, they brought in donuts, they learned my name, they smiled back at me, which makes this a kind of vicious cycle of expectations shaping behavior for better or for worse. It all depends on what this initial expectation is. Is it a favorable one or an unfavorable expectation? And there's been a lot of classic kind of research studies on the power of expectations, self-fulfilling prophecies in general. Within an educational context, you had Rosenthal and Jacobson at the University of California, Riverside, going to local elementary schools and doing this really kind of clever experiment where they went up to these like first grade teachers over the summer. So right before they got their class, right before they taught these students how to read and all this sort of stuff. And the researcher said, hey, we're psychologists and we have this new test out there that we can test all of your incoming students and then tell you not who's smarter than who, but who is poised to have this sort of knowledge growth, who is going to just explode in their knowledge and just learn so much this year. So the teachers are like, oh, that's really great. Sure. Like, test my students, let me know what their feedback is, what their results are, which students specifically are primed to have these sort of learning explosions. The crux of this study is that there was no special test. They randomly just picked names out of a hat. So half of the students in that classroom, they lied and told their teacher, said, yeah, these kids, the ones with a smile or with a star on them, those kids specifically are poised to learn so much this year. And it was all random. There was no differences between the kids with stars versus without stars. And then the researcher said, okay, great. I will come back at the end of the academic year and we will test your kids again. So the only thing that the researchers did was step one of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They caused the teacher to have this expectation about certain students. And then that was it. Then they kind of hands off, and then they watched how the school year kind of played out. What you found is the teacher started treating those students differently based on their expectations. If the teacher thought that those students were going to learn a lot, they called on them more often. They assigned more homework. They didn't let them off the hook. They waited a little bit longer, and that sort of popcorn reading, like, really made sure that they got a chance. They didn't accept, like, being lazy or not doing your work or like other things going on. They just like really kind of challenge those students above and beyond. So then the students, right, those targets, interpret their teacher's actions and respond in kind that's consistent with the teacher's expectations. The kids show up and they're like, I'm getting called on a lot. I must pay attention. Or, man, this teacher's not letting me off the hook easy. Like, I should really do my homework, I guess. So the students started responding in a way that challenged them. They actually did learn significantly more, confirming that teacher's expectations, leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what's wild about this classic study on the self-fulfilling prophecy is that the kids that were randomly assigned to the condition where the teacher thought that they were going to learn a lot, by the end of the year, they did learn significantly more than the other students. It's not because the teachers were, biased or hateful or, trying to, treat some kids differently than others. Instead, it was just that subtle expectation that was planted that shaped how the teachers interacted with these kids inadvertently throughout the entire year, that actually caused them to be smarter, right? To learn more that year. So how does a self-fulfilling prophecy relate to politics? Well, politicians are people. Leaders that vote for political leaders, they're people too. And they have expectations and intergroup relations where you have American leaders versus Russian leaders, for instance, folks like JFK, Kennedy versus Khrushchev, leading to the escalation of the Cold War. One of the reasons why there was almost a real war between the US and Russia was because of this sort of escalation, was the sort of expectation that the US had of, I think those Russians are like getting pretty aggressive. I think those Russians don't like us. I think those Russians want to start a war. So just given that expectation in step one, it shaped the United States behavior. They said, well, if Russians really don't like us and we think that they might want to go to war pretty soon, we should start acting or behaving in a way where we ramp up our military. Let's start building a lot more planes. Let's start building a lot more guns. Let's start building a lot more bombs, things like that. And then Russia over there with their satellites are looking and saying, there's a whole lot more planes being built. There's a whole lot more resources being sent on bombs. You know what? If the US is building their armory, then we should probably do the same. So Russia started responding in kind, started being more aggressive, started focusing on their own military, started sending those sort of naval warships off of the coast of Cuba, for instance, which just reinforced the US's expectation of, this group is really aggressive. The same thing happened with Trump and Kim Jong-un recently, when it was this sort of escalation of, will North Korea develop these long-range missiles? Will they be able to include nuclear weapons inside them? How far can those go? They can definitely go to South Korea. Can they go to China? Can they go to Russia? Can they go across the short strip in the Pacific and go to Japan? Can they travel further? Can they hit the West Coast, for instance? And what was happening is some of the US expectations were, you know what, North Korea, their leadership is aggressive. Let's start responding in kind. Like, let's start changing our behavior given that expectation that they're going to be aggressive. Let's start, throwing more tariffs on them. Let's start like trying to take some of their resources away from a kind of global perspective. And then North Korea is like, see, I knew the US was being aggressive. They're throwing these tariffs on us. They're calling us little rocket man, things like that. So then they started responding aggressively in kind by actually doing more and more of those missile tests, which just leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another thing that's important about cognitions isn't just what is your attitude, right? Do you like or dislike something, but what are your attributions? Attribution is just a really fancy word for what's the cause of someone doing the things that they do. So attribution theory is just this sort of theory that people make different explanations for their own behavior. Why am I doing this? Why am I thinking this? What's going on with me? And other people, why did that person cheat on their partner? Why did that person run for office? Why did that person make that comment? And attributions can be either internal or external. Internal attributions blame the person, right? They blame their personality, their disposition. That person slept in because they're lazy. That person went back for seconds because they're hungry. That person is smiling because they're friendly. Notice all of those attributions are all internal, like with inside that individual. It's their personality, their disposition, they're hungry, they're lazy, funny, things like that. Other folks make external attributions. So they blame people's behavior on things outside of themselves. Why did that person smile? Well, because someone was taking a picture, right? They wouldn't have smiled had that picture not been there. Why did that person make that that comment? Well, maybe they felt pressured by their boss. Maybe that's why they said that. Why is this person smiling? Well, maybe because they're getting paid in like customer service and they just like have to smile because it's their job. Notice that this person is engaging in the same behavior, but there's a couple of different ways of explaining it. Is it an internal attribution or an external attribution? And those attributions are really important because they change the way that we interact with people. If someone like Bill Clinton cheats on his wife at that time, the first lady, Hillary Clinton, people are wondering why. Like, why did Hillary Clinton cheat, have sex with Monica Lewinsky? Some folks would make an internal attribution and say, well, he's a liar, he's a cheater, he's immoral, and attack the person's character. If that's the case, you're unlikely to forgive. If you make an external situation and say, maybe it was a moment of weakness, maybe he drank too much, maybe he was really stressed out from work and the pressures of the presidency and things like that. Maybe had it been a different situation, he wouldn't have cheated. If you started appreciating the social or kind of external attributions out there, you'd be much more likely to forgive that person. And what's interesting is when people make these attributions, they often commit what's called the fundamental attribution error, or what's sometimes called the correspondence bias. Both refer to the exact same thing. The fundamental attribution error argue that when you do a behavior, right, when you do something, we tend to make external attributions for ourselves. But when someone else does that exact same behavior, we make internal attributions for someone else. So basically, it's this kind of double standard of, let's say you are speeding on the freeway, right? And you're like tailgating somebody. If you were to ask, like, why am I tailgating this person? Why am I driving so fast? I'm on this person's bumper. We will say, well, it's because I'm late for class. It's because there's a really good song on and I was like rocking out. Because I was racing to the hospital, someone's really sick and I had to get there. Notice, like, we're explaining our behavior from an external attribution, right? Because of the situation. But when we're driving and all of a sudden someone starts tailgating us, right? Someone's speeding right on our bumper, we blame their personality, right? Internal attribution. They're a jerk, they're, road rage, they're inconsiderate. Like, we start blaming their personality. That double standard is referred to as the fundamental attribution error. And it's explained by this actor-perceiver difference between actors, us, right? And perceivers, like other people around us. We have different access to information. We know about the hospital and how we're rushing there. We know what songs on the radio, and it was just, a really good jam, and we were, rocking out. We know that, like, class started 10 minutes ago and we were really late, and that's why we're driving super fast on the freeway. We have access to all of those sort of power of the situation over us, but we don't know, where that person in the car behind us is going. We don't know about the hospital that they're rushing to. We don't know whether they're listening to the radio and whether there's a really good song on. Like, we don't have access to how the situation affects other people as easily. So we tend to blame other people's personality for their behavior. We make internal attributions for others, but external attributions for ourselves. And they've tested this in a variety of really kind of classic ways, including with political related stimuli, like after Fidel Castro, so the dictator in Cuba. What they did is they brought undergraduate psychology students into a lab and said, hey, we are collecting essays about how students feel about communism and dictators and Fidel Castro and kind of things like that. You can choose whatever essay you want to write, very pro-Castro or anti-Castro. It's up to you, freely choose. So then after they kind of chose to either be pro-Castro or chose to write an essay that's anti-Castro, they gave those essays to someone else and said, hey, like, read this essay. The person got to choose whatever they got to write about, pro or con, or pro or anti-Castro. And then they asked the person who's reading the essay, hey, think about the person who wrote it. What do you think their true attitudes are? And if they got to choose what to write about, then it makes sense logically, right? That the person who chose to write a very pro-Castro essay, people assume that person has very pro-Castro attitudes. No duh, right? If someone chooses to write a very anti-Castro attitude, like, we know, right, no duh, that they should presumably have really anti-Castro attitudes. They chose their position. It makes sense that people can accurately infer whether they are pro or anti. But what about if they were assigned? What if they were kind of forced, say, like, hey, you have to write an essay for this research study, and so many folks have already written have already written pro-Castro essays. We need you. You must. We are forcing you to write like a very pro-Castro essay, or the exact opposite. We're forcing you to write a really anti-Castro attitude. It doesn't matter if you don't believe it or not, but, like, we're forcing you to write this essay that's either pro or anti. And you would think about it logically, if you force someone to write this essay, it doesn't tell you anything about how they truly feel, right? We force them to. So when people make inferences, you think it would be the same, right? That, 50-50, you couldn't really infer anything about someone's attitude if you force them to write this essay. But we don't find that. Instead, what we find is that same sort of fundamental attribution error. We think that, hey, this person wrote this essay, they must have really pro-Castro attitudes, right? If they wrote this essay in favor of Castro. But that's not the case, right? Or if you force someone to write an anti-Castro attitude, people still infer that their real attitudes are anti-Castro. But we force them. It shouldn't tell us anything about themselves. We should appreciate the situation, but people don't do that, right? There's this actor-perceiver difference, and we commit this fundamental attribution error and infer that the reason why they wrote that essay the way that they did is because it reveals something truly about their personality and their true values. So that is the fundamental attribution error at work. So what I want to do now is kind of talk about some other ways that people think about the world, specifically when it comes to problem solving, when they are presented with, like, tough questions that they don't know the answer to. How do people solve those questions? And the answer is heuristics. They have these tricks or rules of thumb, kind of snapshot, like quick ways of just like quickly coming to simple conclusions for really tough questions that they don't know the answer to. Like, is the US national debt greater or less than $578 trillion? You're like, I don't know. That seems like a lot of money. Is the percentage of Americans in poverty more or less than 2%? It's like, well, I don't know the exact percentage, but 2% seems a little low. Maybe it's a little more than that. The Texas's 2020 Senate race cost $4.2 million. Did Maine's Senate race cost more or less? It's like, well, Maine is smaller than Texas, so it probably costs less. If Texas costs 4.2, maybe Maine's costs like 2.1 million, half of that or something like that. Notice that when we're presented with these questions under uncertainty, right? We don't know the answer. What we do is use a heuristic. And there are 3 different types of heuristics out there. The first type I want to talk about is this anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Anchoring meaning that like in those questions, is the US national debt greater or less than $578 trillion? It's like, I don't know, but now I'm latching on, I'm anchoring on that $578 trillion number that you gave me. I think it's wrong, right? I think it's too high. And what people do is they anchor on that number and then they adjust downwards from there. But the problem is people tend to adjust insufficiently. So they say, no, 578 trillion is too much money. Maybe it's only 550 trillion, right? So it leads people into a guess, but they're typically, their guess is often wrong if they use an anchor that was way too high, for instance. The second heuristic is referred to as the representativeness heuristic. So the representativeness heuristic is associated with like kind of stereotyping and trying to understand like what groups or categories, things or people or issues belong to. So before I give you a definition of what the representativeness heuristic is, let me hit you with a situation, like a scenario. Imagine Linda, right? Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in an anti-nuclear demonstration. So Linda, just based on her own kind of thinking here, she sounds like a philosophy major, right? She sounds like someone who's active in the feminist movement. She's politically motivated, protesting all this stuff. Like, it sounds like she's active in the feminist movement. So when you ask people, which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller, which there's not a whole lot of information to really suggest that she would be a bank teller. It doesn't seem all that likely. Or is it more probable that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? The vast majority of people will select this second answer and think, oh, it's more probable, right, that Linda is a bank teller and she's active in the feminist movement. But that is statistically impossible. Let's say that 5% of people in the world are bank tellers. What's the probability that Linda's a bank teller? Well, like 5%. What percentage of people in the world are bank tellers and active in the feminist movement? Basically, it's like what 5% of bank tellers are out there and how many are active in the feminist movement? Like not very many of them, right? It's like a subset of bank tellers. So there's only let's say that only 1% of bank tellers are active in the feminist movement. There's no way statistically that someone being a bank teller and active in the feminist movement could be more probable than someone just being a bank teller. But people get this question wrong over and over again because they're relying on this representativeness heuristic. In short, they're estimating the likelihood of an event by comparing it to the existing kind of prototype or category that they have. So how likely is Linda to be in the feminist movement? Well, she seems to fit that to a T, so they must go together. The same reason why when people hear that you're from California, they might assume that you're a surfer. Or if you are from the Middle East, they might assume that you're a terrorist, even though that's not true at all. But after September 11th, on the news, there was like who are these hijackers, what's going on? And they shared a lot of pictures and people were like, I'm not sure who this group is. It tends to look like someone who is from the Middle East. So then they create this category of, if you're from the Middle East, then you must be a terrorist. And that is not true at all. But the reason why people continue to use that stereotype is because of this representativeness heuristic. They're trying to estimate the likelihood of that happening by comparing it to the existing prototype, even if that sort of prototype is too general and not useful. So the third heuristic out there is called the availability heuristic. And it's all about kind of how likely is this to occur. So you can ask people questions under uncertainty, like which kills more people every year? Homicides, animal attacks, terrorist attacks. And you kind of think to yourselves like, well, I'm not really sure, but let me think about like how many, friends of mine or, like have talked about this homicide rate. How many friends of mine have talked about like animal attacks, things like that. Recently on the news, like how many terrorist attacks, have there been? And like right after September 11th, like terrorist attacks got a lot of attention, right? It's like every night you were talking about it. There was like the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and going after Saddam Hussein and like where they live and which caves and all this sort of coverage of Osama bin Laden and like going after him. So even though terrorist attacks are incredibly rare, people thought that they were more prevalent than they actually are. The same way like your grandma gets really nervous, like when you're staying out late on a Friday night, it's like, well, someone's gonna stab you. It's like, no, stabbings are incredibly rare. You're just watching too much TV, right? Like every time you are watching the news or a crime show, they're talking about someone who got stabbed, even though that's a really rare event, because you're watching that show so frequently, you think it's more common than it actually is. Basically, they're engaging in this availability heuristic, which is just a judgment based on how easily examples come to mind. So if you were to ask people, like, how likely is it that politicians are frauds, right? That they like are morally corrupt and they steal a bunch of money from their campaigns? Probably a rare thing, right? There's a ton of political leaders out there and few of them are doing that. But when they do, it reaches national headlines, right? They're recalled, they're put in jail, they're, like you hear about it on the news. So even though like fraud like is a really rare event, when you hear a lot about it, just because it's been covered a lot on the news, you think it's more common. Like you think that every politician out there is corrupt when that's not the case at all. So anyway, that is like the three different kind of heuristics that people just use to make sense about the world around them. Another theory related to attitudes and cognition that I really, really love are these cognitive consistency theories. And cognitive consistency just refers to people wanting this sort of like balance or harmony between their attitudes. And when their attitudes and behaviors like don't line up, it makes people uncomfortable. When their attitudes about the world don't line up, it makes people uncomfortable. Kind of puts this sort of pressure on them to maintain harmony or consistency between their attitudes and behaviors. There's a few different cognitive consistency theories I want to talk about. The first one is cognitive dissonance theory. So before I give you a definition of what cognitive dissonance theory is, let's think about a situation here. What would it feel like to write an essay arguing for a reduction in handicap funding for students at APU? It would be really weird, right? Kind of off-putting. Like most people are the exact opposite. They don't want to reduce funding for handicapped students. Instead, they want like probably even more when they realize like how unaccommodating APU's campus is for for students who are physically handicapped. So what would it feel like to be writing this essay saying like, yeah, less funding for the handicap, but your attitude is the exact opposite? It's like, I don't believe what I'm writing here. When your attitude and behavior don't line up, it makes people uncomfortable. What would it feel like to practice twice a day in the summer heat for a team that you didn't want to be on? You're doing these push-ups, you're doing these burpees, you're running lap after lap, you're sweating bullets, getting sunburned, and you're like, I hate this team, right? It's like, I'm doing this behavior, but I don't like the team that I'm doing it for. Like, it should make you feel uncomfortable. Like, why am I doing this, right? that sort of uncomfortable feeling that people are motivated to reduce. What would what would you do if there was like a doomsday cult, right? And they're all waiting for the world to end Friday at midnight, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, like, I'm waiting here, I'm part of this cult, but I don't think this is going to happen, right? I've sold all my possessions, I'm here with the cult, I'm believing what they're doing, we're meditating, we're all holding hands, like I'm going through the actions here, but I don't believe it. What happens, right? It should make you kind of feel uncomfortable, like you're leading people on, like there's this imbalance or inharmony between your own attitudes and behavior. That's referred to as cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling that people are motivated to reduce. And there's been a few kind of classic examples of that, of cognitive dissonance. And one of the people who did a really great job of researching cognitive dissonance was this guy, Leon Festinger. And what Leon Festinger did is designed the most boring story of all time, the most boring research study possible. He wanted people to feel cognitive dissonance. So what he did is he invited people into the lab and said, hey, we are going to do a study on the effect of preparatory mindset on performance. It sounds like a doozy just right off the get-go. Basically, what Leon Festinger did is tell people, hey, I'm going to set your preparatory mental set. I'm going to tell you that this study is really fun and really exciting. And then I'm going to measure your performance doing that task. So these participants showed up and they are like, okay, great. I've heard this study is really fun, really exciting. And then the task is put in front of them. And it's this wooden square board with all these kind of pegs on it. And Leon Festinger said, all right, your job is to take each one of those pegs and turn it a quarter turn to the left, so counterclockwise. And people did that for an hour straight. And you're thinking to yourself, like, this study sucks, like so incredibly boring. So then after the hour's up, you're like, whew, I'm done, get me out of here. The researcher comes up and says, oh, thank you so much for participating. Normally, the next research assistant kind of comes in and relieves me, and like it's their job to kind of basically lie and tell the next group of participants how fun and exciting this study is. Would you do me a favor? Would you do that? Would you act as this research assistant and basically lie and tell the next group of participants how fun and exciting this study is? And in response to do that, the researcher said, I'll give you $1 to basically lie, or I'll give you $20 to basically lie. And all the participants said, sure, yeah, fine. If you need this done for you, I'll do this. I will do you this favor. So all of the participants went up to the next group and said, yeah, this study is really fun and exciting. It's kind of like a puzzle. You have to kind of figure it out. It's awesome. You guys are going to enjoy it so much. Lying through their teeth because they know that this study really, really sucked. So then after that, after they basically lied to all of these participants, the researcher pulled them aside and says, wow, here's your money. Thank you for doing that, by the way. But between you and me, on a 1 to 7 scale, from 1, not at all interesting, to 7, extremely interesting, honestly, how did you really feel towards this study? And what you found is most people were like, honestly, this study sucked. It was so boring, right? That's their true attitudes. But what if you pay them? What if you paid them to lie? A lot of theories and a lot of people would say, well, if you're paid more money to lie, then you would like enjoy the study more, right? You got paid $20 for it, you're gonna enjoy it more than the $1 condition. But what happens is you see the exact opposite. People who got paid $20 were like, yeah, honestly, this study really sucked. It was really, really bad. 2 out of 7. But the folks who only got paid $1 were the ones that were saying, yeah, this study is awesome. It's really, really fun. You're going to love it. They changed their attitude. And by the end of it, they're like, you know what? Honestly, I really did kind of enjoy that study. About a 6 out of 7. Interesting, right? So what is it about this $1 that caused them to feel so much cognitive dissonance? When you think about it from a cognitive dissonance perspective, why did they lie? right? When you're telling someone this study was really fun and exciting, but your behavior is the exact opposite. Like, you know that the study was terrible, but you're telling other people how fun and exciting it was. That sort of lie makes people feel uncomfortable. Why are you doing that? The people that got $20, they're like, you know what, I can justify it. $20 is sufficient justification that I can be like, yeah, I lied to people, but I got paid $20. So I can justify this day really sucked, but I'm lying because I got $20, like enough money to justify it. In the $1 condition, there is insufficient justification. You're stuck there thinking, I personally, I think this study was terrible, but I'm lying and telling other people how fun and exciting it was. Why am I doing this? For $1? That's it? $1 was insufficient justification. So what happened when people's attitudes and behaviors didn't align? They changed their attitude. And they said, you know what, like, actually, maybe this study really was fun. Maybe I did really enjoy it. Yeah. 6 out of 7. That is cognitive dissonance theory at work. So cognitive dissonance theory argues that when there is insufficient justification, right? Not enough money, not enough pressure to justify why someone's attitudes and behaviors don't line up, people will most likely change either their behavior or change their attitude to make them in harmony or consonant. But the problem is it's so much easier to change your attitudes than it is to invent a time machine and go back in time and change your behavior. So in cognitive dissonance theory, people are more likely to change their attitudes to be consistent with their behavior. And the effect of cognitive dissonance theory is greatest when there's choice. Hey, do you want to do this? I'll pay you $1. Do you want to lie? I'll pay you $20. When people feel like they had their choice, man, I chose to lie. I chose to say this day was really fun and exciting, when personally my true attitude is this day was awful. That sort of choice really ramps up this cognitive dissonance. It makes people more motivated to change their attitude. So cognitive dissonance theory is really counterintuitive, but does a tremendous job of explaining why some people are so highly committed to the really costly or really painful pursuits. So as a US citizen, I love that the US Army and Marines and Navy and things like that will have these sort of hell weeks and training camps and kind of basic training where it is hellish for these new recruits, for people that just signed up to be part of the military. And by the way, like, notice that there wasn't a draft, like they chose to join the military, their choice. So they choose to, show up at basic training, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you like your hair? We're shaving all your hair off. You like to sleep in? We're getting up at 5 a.m. You like to, relax on the couch and just unwind? We're going to be doing push-ups and pull-ups and laps until you puke. It's like, okay, great. It's lunchtime. Normally you like slowing down, relaxing, eating a nice warm lunch. No, we're getting cold sandwiches and we are flying through this line because we have more exercising to do afterwards. And they do this over and over and over again. And you get some people in there that, as they're falling asleep at night, you're like, what am I doing? Why am I exercising so hard? Why did I shave off my hair? Like, why am I doing all this stuff? When I don't like this, I don't feel happy. I don't feel like this isn't something I would really want to do. So their attitude is, I don't like this, but their behavior is, but I'm doing it. Like, I'm doing it anyway. I'm getting up early. I shaved off my hair. Like, what's going on when their attitudes and behaviors don't align? Some people change their behavior and say, I quit, right? And they're out of there. That's one way of alleviating cognitive dissonance. But most people don't quit. Instead, to alleviate that dissonance, most people change their attitude and say, you know what, this is so worthwhile. I actually love this. I love the Marines. I love being a part of this. And they become incredibly committed to the Army, to the Marines. So much so that they will, get Semper Fi tattooed on their bodies. They will focus so much on their mission, obeying orders, and thank God, keeping the U.S. and the world safe. And not questioning, putting their life at risk because they feel like it's so incredibly worth it. Cognitive distance theory kind of gets them to that highly committed point. Unfortunately, frats and sororities kind of do the same sort of thing. That same sort of hazing example, where it's like, why are you being hazed when your attitude is like, you're a child of God, you're worthwhile, you are like, like a wonderful human being. Why are you letting this person like humiliate you by wearing a diaper, for instance, or like put your life in danger? It's like some people will quit and say, get me out of here, I'm not doing that. But most people change their attitude and say, you know what, like it's because this sorority was so awesome. This fraternity is so stellar. Like it's the best, it's this brotherhood. It's like the only way to do it. Like, and they become highly committed, so much so that they kind of perpetuate that sort of hazing in the future. To more extreme situations of like terrorism and brainwashing and cults. If you need someone to change their attitudes, what you can do is elicit cognitive dissonance. You can force them, or better yet, let them kind of feel like they're choosing to engage in a behavior that is inconsistent with their attitudes. It's like, wait, I love my family, but I'm leaving them behind. I'm moving like far away, not talking to them, not communicating with them ever again. It's like that attitude and behavior are not aligned. So over time, people kind of change their attitudes and say, well, like, I guess I really didn't like need my family all that much. Or they start changing their attitude to kind of justify like this behavior of, yeah, like this cult is so important, we need to do this. The same thing when you have like, the KKK and other like domestic terrorist groups engaging in hate crimes, like burning crosses on people's yards. Like, how did you get to that place of like lynching other people? Like this behavior is like heinous and grotesque and like such a crime. Like, why are you doing this? People's attitudes are like, but I don't want to, like, I don't, view people the same way. They like, this seems so counterintuitive with like egalitarian, like Christian values, right? How do you deal with that cognitive dissonance of like, God is God of love and you're burning the cross to tell people how much you hate them? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So some people will change their behavior and say, I'm not doing this, I'm dropping out. Other people will change their attitudes and say, oh, it must be because like this group deserved it, or like, and finding other ways of like changing their attitudes to justify the behavior that they're doing. And this sort of cognitive dissonance theory gets brought up whenever you hear like hypocrites or moral hypocrisy, like sexually abusive priests or politicians that have affairs in the White House. And it seems so backwards because they ran on platforms of like family values and their family, and like they're all holding their, their partner and their kids up on the stage, waving to everybody. Like that's the image that they're presenting of this like a family person. But then you hear in the news like they were sending like unsolicited pics, nude pictures, or they cheated on their partner, like doing all this sort of like hateful, like sexual discrimination stuff. You're like, how do you deal with that? Like, didn't you know that that was bad? It's like, well, yeah, their attitudes and behaviors didn't align. Which one are you going to change? Some people change their behavior and say, I'm not going to cheat on my partner. I'm not going to send this picture. Like, this is, inappropriate. Other people change their attitude. Say, well, it's just a picture. It wasn't that bad. Right? Finding ways to kind of justify their behavior. Another cognitive consistency theory besides cognitive dissonance theory is balance theory. Balance theory is awesome because it does a really nice job of explaining the cognitive consistency pressure between people's attitudes towards others and people's attitudes towards issues and values and objects and things like that. So according to balance theory, you have a POX triad or triangle here. The P stands for the person, so you, right? O stands for someone else. So your mom, your neighbor, Hitler, like anyone else. And you can have either favorable or unfavorable attitudes towards other people, right? You can like or dislike your mom. You can like or dislike your neighbor. You can like or dislike Hitler. You, the person, also can have favorable or unfavorable attitudes towards objects, towards Diet Coke, right? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Towards political parties. Do you like Republicans? Do you dislike Republicans? Do you like socialism? Do you dislike socialism? Like whatever the attitude is. the latest movie that just came out, for instance. So if you liked your next door neighbor and you really liked Diet Coke, for instance, you can achieve cognitive balance by thinking about, how does my neighbor feel towards Diet Coke? If I like my neighbor and I like Diet Coke, then I'm going to infer that my neighbor also likes Diet Coke. That sort of inference here would achieve cognitive balance or harmony or consonance amongst people's attitudes. And one way that you can tell whether people's attitudes are balanced is by multiplying the sides. Positive times positive is positive. So positive times positive is also positive. So this would be a balanced triad. Let's say that you hated Hitler and you love Diet Coke, right? How do you think Hitler feels towards Diet Coke? You can achieve cognitive balance by assuming that Hitler hates Diet Coke, right? You hate Hitler, so negative times positive, you love Diet Coke, negative times positive is negative, negative times a negative is positive, leading to a balanced triad. So any combination here, if you multiply the sides and it's positive, you'll have a balanced triad. And this does a really good job of kind of filling in the gaps of like, you know what, I'm not sure how I feel about Bernie Sanders, right? But I really hate income inequality. I really hate that Jeff Bezos has billions and billions of dollars, and so many people are dying of starvation and homelessness and things like that, and him not paying his workers living wage and things like that. So let's say that you don't know how you feel about Bernie Sanders, for instance, but you are really negative on income inequality. And then you watch a speech of Bernie Sanders, and he is also saying how much he hates income inequality. You're like, huh, I am just like Bernie Sanders, right? He hates income inequality. I hate income inequality. I can achieve cognitive consistency by liking Bernie Sanders. So this sort of similarity breeds liking effect is explained by balance theory really well. Or this repulsion hypothesis. It's man, I hate slavery, and someone else comes along and they're like, I love slavery. You're like, really? I really dislike you just because you and I are so different on this value. Balance theory does a really nice job of explaining all of these sort of balanced triads and unbalanced triads that make people feel uncomfortable. Especially when it comes to politics and voting, a lot of people feel kind of uncomfortable where it's I love my family, but they voted differently than I did on this issue, right? Can lead to a lot of kind of dissonance where people are either I change my position on that issue, or you change your position on your family, right? That issue is just not important to me. You kind of disengage with politics in general, or you start to, like your family less, for instance, if they view the world differently than you do, which is unfortunate that politics can drive people apart, but balance theory does a nice job of kind of explaining what's going on there. So anyway, that is cognition and attitudes, a big part of how people think about their political world. Another related concept is social identity, how people kind of think about themselves, which groups they choose to identify with. Some social identities are visible. You can, look at someone and infer their gender. You can look at someone and infer their ethnicity, for instance. But there's some social identities that are invisible, like looking at someone and inferring their political affiliation, for instance. According to social identity theory, it doesn't matter what group it is, whether it is identifying as Christian or as a Laker fan or as an AP Cougar, all those are different social groups. And we can identify more or less strongly with any one of those groups. And we can kind of pick up different identities and cast them aside in a motivational way. Meaning that according to social identity theory, people are motivated to see themselves and others in these categories. Specifically, people are motivated to maintain a positive and distinct view of themselves. So they will identify with groups that are doing really well because those reflect positively on them. And the groups that they're connected to that are underperforming, that are having a hard time, they kind of distance themselves from. So it does a really good job of explaining why people will put like signs in their yard saying who they voted for. And they'll leave those signs up or those bumper stickers like years down the road because they're saying, hey, this is my social identity out there. And I view that group positively and I'm a part of that group. So they're kind of basking in that reflected glory. And just this pressure of like belonging to groups and cutting off groups sets the world up into an us versus them. It sets us up into an in-group versus an out-group. And the scary thing about our lecture on prejudice, which we'll cover later on in the semester, is that once you identify us versus them, in-group versus out-group, that is all that you need to start expressing prejudice towards others. So why do people categorize? Why are people so quick to break the world up into groups? Because people are trying to figure out who am I and who are you? Are we the same or are we different? If we're the same, then I like you, right? You're part of my in-group. If we're different, you're part of a different group and dislike you, right? Out-group derogation. And also, how am I doing, right? Are you better or worse than me? So classifying our world and defining ourselves in relation to the world, the groups that we belong to, are all ways of us maintaining a positive and distinct social identity. So this motive to maintain a positive and distinct social identity can lead to basking in reflected glory, often called verging for short. So like leaving signs up after your candidate won, or like taking those signs down right away, like not wearing those Hillary hats anymore, like after your candidate lost. Cutting off reflected failure, kind of distancing yourself from a negatively, from a group that's underperforming, is referred to as quarfing, cutting off reflected failure. And verging is basking in reflected glory. So very motivational, but explains why some people are kind of like fair weather fans or bandwagon fans, and they'll start identifying more or less with different groups, depending on how well those groups are doing. The last thing I want to talk about is when people think about themselves and the world and problem solving, we aren't just these computers trying to make sense of the world. We're operating in a very hot and motivational way as well. We experience emotions. Sometimes these emotions are positive and sometimes these emotions are negative. And emotions will motivate people to view the world in certain ways. It depends on the emotion. And it's not surprising in politics when you're trying to get people to vote or suppress votes. A lot of those advertisements are very emotionally laden. When they're trying to persuade people, like how to get out to the polls, what should you do? How should I vote on this issue? Instead of bombarding people with facts, a lot of times they go for more of these sort of fear appeals or like happiness, appeals, like trying to elicit some type of emotion. And all of these pictures are kind of set up in ways that like elicit a very kind of visceral emotion from people. Visceral, primal, and functional, they're universal. There are, well, people used to think there were 6 universal emotions. Now there's actually 7, meaning you can go to any part of the globe, show people these pictures, right? You smile, you frown, you leave your mouth a little bit agap, your eyebrows kind of raise up a little bit versus your mouth being more open, your eyebrows even more raised. And people can accurately infer, are you happy? Are you angry? Are you scared? Are you surprised? Are you sad? Are you disgusted? And what they find is, regardless of which culture, whether they've seen someone like you or not, whether they speak your same language, you can look at someone's face and accurately infer how they're feeling, which is incredibly functional, right? When you're, talking about the meal that you just made and someone shows some of this like disgusting face, like that they don't like it. When you talk about your boyfriend or girlfriend and your family starts like smiling, like you can infer and have this sort of functional response that like they like this person, I should get more serious or I should bring them around more often. So the emotions of other people is a really great way of getting kind of feedback. Are they accepting this? Are they not? Are they, digging this or are not, or are they not? So anyway, the 7 universal emotions are sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise, happiness, and they later added on content. But let's talk about a few of these. So why does politics play with our emotions? Because these issues like abortion, immigration, like you name it, terrorism, like all these political issues, these candidates and parties can strategically elicit either positive or negative emotions to get you to feel different things, to get you to think different things, to get you to do different things. So the first emotion, let's talk about it as a negative emotion of anxiety. Do you feel worried? Do you feel stressed? Do you feel apprehensive, threatened, like this situation isn't going to go well, something bad might happen? And there's a lot of ways of presenting stories, like your horror stories, or like news of we might go to war or not, who doesn't really know, or not sure how the pandemic's going to end, what's going on. And they just ramp up anxiety. What happens when you activate, this negative emotion of anxiety is people stop dead in their tracks and they start paying attention. They're like, I'm fearful, I'm threatened, I'm unnerved, I'm worried about what's going to happen. So they pause, become more focused, and they seek out answers. So if your job, if you just want to draw more attention to an issue, anxiety is a great way to fuel more information seeking. Other times, you might want to piss people off, right? You might want to share some news that they don't want to hear and elicit the feeling of anger. Anger is a negative emotion, but it's also an approach emotion, meaning when someone's goals are so frustrated, they're so angry that the situation played out the way that it did, anger elicits this approach. What can I do about it? How can I solve this issue? Who do I need to punch? Which cause do I need to donate to? Like it's eliciting some sort of behavior from you. So it's not surprising when both like Republicans and Democrats will reach into their base and say, hey, I know your values align with mine, but we need more motivation. We need more bucks donated to our cause. We need more volunteers for this. And they'll often say things like, hey, this filibuster, like we have these goals and they are being passed. Doesn't that make it angry? Right? Or like, can you believe that the other party is like changing these legislations, that they are making these mask mandates? Doesn't that make you angry at this potential loss of freedom? Kind of talking about how those goals might be threatened or frustrated, and it motivates people to kind of approach some sort of reconciliation there. Like, what can I do differently to solve this issue that's caused me to be really angry? So interesting here that just the emotions of anxiety and anger are both negative, but they do different things. Pause and think versus approach. Let me do something about this issue. Another negative emotion is disgust. Disgust is negative, but it's a withdrawal. It leads to a withdrawal approach. So you're like, ew, like that's disgusting food. I'm not going to eat it. Ew, that person is like, 50 years old and they're dating someone who's 16. Like that's disgusting. Like withdrawing from that. You can see that same sort of like mudslinging in political advertisement as well to get people to identify less with their political party, kind of like thwart, like discouraging people from voting, for instance. And there's some emotions out there beyond just the 7 universal emotions, meaning there are some emotions that are only found in different parts of the world that are kind of social emotions, but they aren't universal. They're elicited by the social ways that we set up our world. And some of these are like self-conscious emotions, like embarrassment. Do you feel embarrassed for what you did? And what people are basically doing is comparing, like, did I live up to other people's expectations? Did I fall short of the church expectation, the norm, the legal bar, the goal that your parents had for you? Like, did you fall short of that? Were you exposed for doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing? It makes people feel embarrassed, incredibly aversive, unpleasant emotion. But it motivates attempts to win back people's opinion. When people are embarrassed of like, man, like I got a DUI, or I cheated on my partner, like, and it gets exposed, like, man, I fell short of of my bar for myself. What can I do? Like, who do I need to apologize to? How do I reestablish my value in society again? Things like that. So unsurprisingly, given the group focus, leads to more conformity. Other social emotions are positive, like pride, which is the exact opposite. You have the sort of societal expectations, and then you meet it. You meet those valued expectations, and then other people like start praising you because of it. You start feeling really good. You start getting the rewards. You get the recognition. You're like, you know what? I'm going to do more of this because it's being rewarded. So anyway, that is all I have for today's lecture. If you have any questions, let me know. All right, take care.